shame that Callum Illott, a sort of driver like Callum Illott, can't get at least a season on the F1 grid.
How much spatial awareness the drivers have to be able to go 3 wide on an oval.
Clearly got pace in the ovals, but it's just, I just don't see how any other driver on the circuit would survive that.
I just root for the underdog. It might be controversial to call Marcus Ericsson an underdog because people who saw him in F1 probably think he's a pay driver.
Oh, Zach, you have to let that man drive that car. Hello and welcome to Stripping the Dipping. It's your boy AMG Denz, and I'm on the wire like Marlo Stanfield. And I got something a bit different for you guys this week. Let's get into it. It pretty much is the greatest spectacle in motorsport. It's one of 3 elements of the Triple Crown. It's the one and only Indy 500. And talking about triple, it feels like I'm on the cast of Earth, Wind, and Fire today because I'm on Earth. F1blag is trying to avoid the British weather and wind, and Molly's bringing that fire. So I'll start off with F1blag first. How is everything going, man? And are you enjoying the essentially British summer right now that we have?
Yeah, we have to do the British thing and talk about the weather. But yeah, I mean, there was at least sort of like 1 kilogram of sun or however you measure it. It was lovely today, yeah. How are you?
Yeah, all good as well. Just trying to be as bright as the sun, as you've mentioned. And yeah, like all times in the UK, you've just got to enjoy every single second of the sun because you're just like, yeah, this is going to be followed by like, a flood of rain or just like torrential downpours or just like, my mother always used to say to me growing up that like growing up in England is the only place where you can get all 4 seasons in one day, which she was quite right about that one. So absolutely. But also, I'm very enthused to have our other special guest all the way on the other side of the pond from the States. She goes by the name on Twitter of Molly FS44. Molly, it's so great to have you on our debut episode show as well. How is everything going with you? And what did you make? I mean, probably without the spoilers, of that surprising conclusion to the Indy 500.
Yes, thank you for having me. I'm doing great. It's a beautiful day in California, so I get to be the smug Californian enjoying the perfect weather over here. So hello to all you on the other side of the pond. Yeah, thank you for having me on. It's exciting to chat with you guys about the Indy 500. It was a surprising ending. I don't know if we want to get spoilers now or further down the line, but it was. But the thing about the Indy 500 is it is probably one of the least predictable races reliably year after year. So every year I've watched it, I've just thought like, I don't know who's going to win. I kind of go in with an open mind because anything can happen. So.
Exactly, and I think you summarized it perfectly, Molly. Even just like backstage when me and F1blag were just having a chat about that, he said literally verbatim the same thing, just like as to how unpredictable it is. And again, it's an interesting series because the chassis is the same, but again, the teams are completely different. And then you also have 2 different engine manufacturers as well. So I'll get into the specifics in a second about the cars, the event, the history, the drivers and whatnot. But Molly, whilst we're with you at the moment, how did you start following IndyCar, and what would you say makes it such a unique series compared to other open wheeler series like F1? Oop, and I think we've lost connection to Molly. So I'm going to bear that thought and question for a second. I will revert to F1blag. And I had an individual question specialized for you as well, man. So my question to you was going to be, what were your earliest IndyCar memories? And does it surprise you at all that we've had the likes of Pablo Montoya, Alex Zanardi, even Jack Villeneuve, for example, transition from IndyCar or kart racing, as it was known back into the day, into F1 at parts of their careers?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I can remember IndyCar probably in the 90s, vague kind of recollection of seeing something that I thought was a McLaren but wasn't, and thinking, why is that Marlboro red and white sponsorship on a weird looking car? And then we've tweeted about this, but a couple of computer games, I think I got one free with my PC in one of the 90s years that I won't mention because it will age me. But Mark Blundell going over to Champ Car or Kart as it was, I remember that. And then in terms of the crossover, I mean, Yeah, there's a bit of snobbery, I think, in Europe about IndyCar. People think, oh, it's a lower tier, or it's sort of a spec series, or it's just ovals. This season, for example, there's only 4 ovals. The rest is street tracks, and they're really talented drivers. So it doesn't surprise me at all that Jack Villeneuve, double champion, Juan Pablo Montoya, with a bit of luck, could have won the F1 championship. Yeah, it doesn't surprise me at all.
Absolutely, and I think it's such a key point that you mentioned there too, in terms of the transferability of both of those series. And we've seen a lot of transitions from different drivers. And it's such a cool thing as well, because like you mentioned, there has been a bit of snobbery, I guess, from the European side when it comes to Indy racing. But then when you look at that series as a whole, it's super challenging. You have to be very brave, to commit yourself to the speeds that they travel at. And also, pretty much those cars are the most extreme prototypes, I think, that exist on the planet in terms of what they're able to do, how much downforce they generate, how they can follow each other in dirty air, which has been a big emphasis for the FIA in relation to this year's F1 car. So again, it's almost as if like both hands kind of rub each other's backs in that sense too. But now that we've got Molly back in the chat as well, I just wanted to put forward to you as well, Molly, like, how did you get into following IndyCar, and what would you say are the big differences from that series in compared to other open wheeler series as well?
Yeah, so I started following IndyCar in 2018. Always loved cars, loved fast cars. But I had recently moved to the LA area, and the Long Beach Grand Prix is right here. So bought tickets and went for the weekend, and just thought it was the coolest thing. Like, just seeing these race cars in person is just so exciting. And I was hooked. So I've been watching ever since. In terms of the kind of what makes IndyCar unique, I think it's a really good mix of strategy and sort of emphasis on the driver. The team strategy is important, but because the cars are largely similar or the same, driver performance can really make a big difference. It's also pretty unpredictable. You have a lot of different race winners, and there's a lot of races where just you can't necessarily, unlike something like F1 where somebody in a fast car can potentially carve through the field and still win the race. That can happen in IndyCar, but it doesn't always, because the cars are equal in performance. So it's really more dependent on drivers playing luck. So it just makes for a really interesting watch, I think.
I agree with you, and I think a lot of people would echo you on those sentiments as well, Molly, in terms of just how nuanced IndyCar is as a sport. And as you mentioned, and I'm going to probably do a deep dive on it as well, is just like how critical strategy is. There's a lot of fuel saving involved as well. There's also tire management that comes into it. And like you mentioned, because the chassis is pretty much the same for everyone, you can pretty much set up the car in one way on the weekend that might suit qualifying, but then in the race, you could obviously maybe jeopardize or sacrifice performance for the long-term run. So definitely some good points there. And also I think it'd be really valuable to maybe touch on your Long Beach experiences too, watching it trackside, and just getting insight into that too, because it's always lovely to kind of hear what it's like to go to a race nearby and whatnot as well. But what I'll do, just for those who live underneath a rock, know Dwayne Johnson, great pun there. I wanted to kind of go into the background of the Indy 500 as to what makes it so special as its own standoff event, and just the history behind it too. So basically, the Indy 500 is a thrilling speedway race. It was first run back in 1911, before F1blag had grey hairs, wink wink. And yes, held in the state of Indiana. It's a 500-mile race, average speeds in excess of 234 miles an hour. So it's quite a lot of speed. The chassis constructor is Dallara. They're the same people that make the chassis for the F2 car, and actually, ironically enough, do a lot of work with Haas in the F1 team too. The name of the current chassis that's being run in that series is the DW12, and actually, it's a very nice tribute to Dan Wheeldon. He was an English racing driver that unfortunately lost his life 2 days after test driving the current chassis of IndyCar. So in actually segueing that, it's been so interesting to see how Dallara have evolved that chassis over the years, because it's a spec series, because back in the day it didn't have an aero screen. And in 2018, for the first time, Scott Dixon and Joseph Newgarden, who liked my tweet today, so shout out Joseph Newgarden, you're going to get the props from me today, was the first to test the DW12 chassis with what we know now as the aero screen, and it's been mandated for the IndyCar series. It's an alternative concept to the Halo, and it's been so integral in saving the lives of many drivers in such, like, you know, high-speed incidents. So as we also touched on as well, you got two engine suppliers. So you have Chevrolet, you also have Honda on the other side of the pond as well. And again, for me, it's so cool, like, following IndyCar, because, like, with F1, and I think we're going to touch on this later as well, it can be quite tribal in how the teams are and how the fans react with the teams and so forth. Whereas in IndyCar, I think of the teams almost as if they're like stables. For example, you've got Team Penske, and that's the likes of Joseph Newgarden, Will Power, which again I think is a great name. Like, he's got the will and the power. You can't get better than that. And then of course you've got the legendary Andretti Autosport, which is owned by the legendary, Mario Andretti. Yeah, you might want to know why I coughed, but I'm not going to get into that. And you got the likes of Colton Herta and also the crispy nugget, Romain Grosjean. They're currently too trying, to resalvage his career. So love to see it. And again, you got other teams there too. Like, you even have McLaren. McLaren, not many people know, but McLaren also have an IndyCar team. So that's branded as the Arrow McLaren SP team. It's got one of my favorite drivers currently, very hot prospect, Patricio Award, hashtag Pato Sauce, and the likes of Felix Rosenqvist as well, another great Swedish driver. And then even on the other side as well, you've got Chip Ganassi Racing. They've got loads of heritage in the sport, and they've got probably the biggest stable of drivers, from Marcus Ericsson, which we're going to touch on, Scott Dixon, probably one of the most successful IndyCar drivers in the history of the sport, Jimmie Johnson, which I just love saying that name because it's such an American name, Jimmie Johnson. But I'll come back to him. And then the reigning world IndyCar champion as well, Alex Palou. So that was my little breakdown, guys. I hope that I said everything correctly, because for me, this being European tuning into it, I know that there's still so much to uncover. But going into this race, guys, I just wanted to get your expectations, because we touched on how unpredictable it is. And obviously, we had Scott Dixon get pole position with the fastest pole time recorded in history, average speed of 234 miles an hour. And then Colton Herta, the people's champion, shout out to Anna from the Racing Instant podcast. I know she's got a soft spot for him. I see you. One of her favorites and one of the fan favorites as well. Wrecks the car on Friday, which meant that Andretti Autosport Racing had to completely build a new car. And they basically raced a car that had done no laps, hadn't turned the wheel of the entire circuit from Sunday onwards. So, guys, what was your expectations going into this one?
I'll jump in. I didn't know who was going to win. You can't. No one can predict who's going to win. Scott Dixon looked dominant. He looked like he had. I thought that he had a solid chance of winning. He's not had great luck, over the last few years at Indy. But yeah, I couldn't tell you who I thought was going to win. I'm always rooting for my guy Alex Rossi. I don't know why I like him, but I kind of picked him a few years ago, and now I'm stuck. I won't reveal to people who I support in football, but I take a very similar approach. I don't pick the winningest driver teams. But yeah, I knew it was going to be a great. There was possibly the threat of a bit of inclement weather, and yeah, just unpredictability. That's why I watch it. I loved it.
Absolutely. And Molly, your thoughts as well, just like, going into the race before we touch on the results and some of the talking points from the race?
Yeah, I didn't know. I didn't have my money on anyone in particular. I did, if I'd had to put money on someone, it probably would have been Scott Dixon, just because, I mean, he had everything he needed to win, the pace and and he's come so close a bunch of times. And he's not my favorite driver. I don't dislike him. I don't root for him. I'm just sort of neutral on him. But I will admit he is pretty fantastic, and so you never want to bet against him. Palou came close last year, so I was kind of, I would have been happy to see him win it. Herta started pretty far down on the grid because of that crash you mentioned, but I didn't think he would win, but I was hoping he would have a good day. Unfortunately, it didn't turn out that way. And the person I really wanted to win was Palou, because he's been fantastic this year and last year. And he's really like emerging as, one of the top 2-3 stars. And I just think he's a huge talent. So it's, a lot of, there's actually quite a lot of talent in IndyCar right now, and a lot of people I root for. Pato being probably the top guy right now, but there was a few drivers who I would have been really happy to see on the podium.
Absolutely, and it's great, Molly, that you touched as well on the whole like Pato emergence, because I think he's really a diamond in the rough and probably not spoken about enough, because of just his ascendancy into IndyCar, how well he's been doing in that McLaren program. And I think we have to have like probably a dedicated segment on the same very show, just as to who we could potentially see in the future if Mr. Kangaroo or Timer Kangaroo down son at McLaren doesn't really get his act together. But yeah, it was such a phenomenal race, and like you guys pointed out, it's just the unpredictability factor and just how also integral crashes are in IndyCar too. They can basically make or break people's races. So just even getting onto the race start, funny thing with IndyCar or Indy 500 is it's a free wide start, which always bamboozles me, just like how much spatial awareness the drivers have to be able to go free wide on an oval, sometimes even 4 wide. And Dixon seemed to get a clean start, as Molly had mentioned as well. It really seemed like he had the race under control. Unfortunately, on lap 38, I think it's Veekay had a bit of a wreck there, which is unfortunate for him because, again, he seems to go quite well at the ovals, and he's the only Dutch driver on the grid at the moment too. So we've seen how Dutch domination goes in certain sports, which we won't get into today. But at least for Veekay, he seems a lot more likable, a lot more personable, which is great, but didn't really seem to be a great start for him. Another talking point was Callum Illott, which is quite a familiar name from F2, part of the Ferrari young driver program, but now he's severed ties with Ferrari completely to do this IndyCar endeavor. Just wanted to ask you guys as well, going through this timeline of events, what do you think of Callum Illott just generally as a younger driver, and do you think Ferrari would have been maybe better to keep him as part of the younger driver program? Because just to give you guys context, like he was basically going for the championship against Mick Schumacher, I think it was 2 years ago. And then unfortunately, Mick won out in that battle for the F2 championship, and Ferrari put all of their kind of like coins in Mick. And then it seemed to be that the relationship with Callum dropped. Do you think maybe they should have kept Callum based on what we're seeing with Mick now, or are you happy that Callum's kind of doing his own thing as a still quite young, nuanced driver?
Yeah, well, I'll jump in. I think it's a shame that Callum Illott, a sort of driver like Callum Illott, can't get at least a season on the F1 grid. It probably speaks a lot about the problems with driver progression, young driver progression onto the grid. If you look at the year where he came second in F2, that's a stacked year. When obviously he lost out to Mick Schumacher, but he beat Yuki Tsunoda, he beat Robert Schwartzman, he beat Mazepin. Okay, we don't rate a lot of the things he's done, but he had a good package that year. He beat other people, Lundgaard, etc. So it was a tough year. He came second, and yet, maybe 20 years ago, he would have found himself in a Minardi or, one of those sort of you all loved. And sadly, he's had to come over. I mean, for him, it makes me root for him more that he's decided, you know what, I don't want to be a reserve driver. I want to go and race in a series and get 20 races under my belt a year. So I think it's a shame. If Ferrari could have kept him, maybe that would have been okay, but I actually prefer to see him racing. I don't know what you think, Molly, about that.
I agree. I think good for him. Like he wants to race and win races, and IndyCar could potentially be that place for him. I think, he hasn't necessarily had a great season so far in IndyCar, but IndyCar is a very different beast than F2. Just the nature of the races and the cars, I think, are probably quite different. So he's going to need a little time to adjust. But I'm glad to see him in a position where he can potentially build a career and a name for himself, and actually win and get podiums. I sort of think it's Ferrari's loss. He's obviously a talent worth considering. I think he was quite. I watched that season of F2. He was quite good. I'm surprised they didn't keep him on as a reserve driver or development driver or something like that. But it's their loss, and I am rooting for him. I want to see him do well and maybe become the next Romain Grosjean of IndyCar. The next guy to step up and give us exciting racing and make a name for himself in America.
Yeah, that's so true, and it's interesting as well just to see how some people transition into IndyCar, because you got the likes of him where things didn't work out as part of a driver program, and it's not all that unfamiliar, because a couple of weeks ago we had the legendary Raffaello Marcello, a very dominant and successful GT3 driver that's also part of that program, and he gave us a lot of insight into how things have changed in the Ferrari driver program, even though essentially it's supposed to be equal stable for young drivers to grow up and go through the ranks. It's always still kind of a sponsorship thing of who has more money and who's going to be more marketable. When you have the son of a 7-time world champion, that was fundamental to their success, you could see commercially why they could play the card that way. But at the same time, as you guys have rightfully mentioned too, it's sad that it's come at Callum Illott's expense, because he's such a talented driver, and he's just as able and just as capable as any of the other drivers we've seen. And also, alternatively, you've got drivers like Alexander Rossi, which F1blag mentioned earlier too. I think he had a season or two at Manor, and again, like it just was sad that he wasn't given enough time really to bed his feet into F1 in a backmarker team which had no prospect of really scoring any points back then. And almost now that we had the Liberty Media takeover and stuff, now there's a push, for American drivers and trying to actually build the bridge again between F1 and IndyCar, which again, big talking point we'll get on later. So yeah, I think great discussion point there too. So to go further down the timeline, I think during that safety car period, you had Alex Palou trying to basically Palou? Is Alex Palou? Yeah,
Yes.
Alex Palou. Why am I down myself? Thank you, Molly. But yeah, you had Alex Palou try to basically pit under the safety car, and it was really heart-wrenching to watch, because just as he pulled up onto pit road to try and go into the pits, they then closed the pit lane. But it was too late for him to cut across the grass and go back onto the circuit. So he had to drive through what was essentially a closed pit. And on the technicality of breaching the rule, he then had to serve a penalty or go again basically to get fueled. So really unfortunate timing of events there. And touching on what Molly said there too, with strategy, it's so pivotal that you could be having the perfect race, you could have the fastest car, you could be out there amongst the top 3 guys getting a nice slipstream and saving fuel, and then you try and take a gamble like that, or you try to be smart with the strategy, and then it backfires with something really technical like that. So that pretty much killed his race from such an early stage. But then also, just to kind of touch on it too, this happened much later in the race, but I think was still a good talking point. I wanted to throw this one to Molly first. What was your expectations, Molly, for Jimmie Johnson? Because my honest assessment, looking as a European is I'm very aware of his success in the NASCAR kind of series, one of the biggest names, he's got all the commercials and, Jimmie Johnson, even in the sim racing thing that I do, there's actually you can install a crew chief, which has Jimmie Johnson's ex-engineer. It's pretty funny. He's clear to the left. I don't know what these jackasses are doing, man. Stay to the right. He's a very successful driver. So you think, okay, you're going to take a successful driver, put him in a spec series, which again, similar in ways or similarities to NASCAR. But yeah, hasn't really had the greatest of success so far. And then even with the oval circuit, you'd think, okay, this is his bread and butter. Ovals, turning left, slipstream, saving fuel, tire management. And still just there, but not quite. Just what's your honest assessment on Jimmie Johnson and just his take on IndyCar so far?
Yeah, okay, let me preface this by saying that Jimmie Johnson seems like the nicest guy in the world. So not to be harsh, but I really think if he didn't have the background and the history and the name and obviously clearly the sponsorship dollars, as you pointed out, the many Jimmie Johnson commercials, and they could talk about him constantly during the broadcast. If he didn't bring all that, I do not see how he would still be racing in the series. But given the amount he's crashed, the amount of time it's taken him to adjust to the cars. I think this is his second year in the series, and granted, until he crashed, he was doing quite well at Indy this year. I think he qualified like 11th or something, which is pretty good. And he's clearly got pace in the ovals, but I just don't see how any other driver on the circuit would survive that in the sport. And IndyCar is not even the most cutthroat of motorsports, but he's just been, he's been kind of, forgive me, the Mazepin of IndyCar. Just a lot of crashes, a lot of damage. It's so I sort of feel for him, but I also think the question has to come up eventually: is he, can he hack it in the series? That being said, just to play devil's advocate, he did crash. I think it was in turn 2, and there was like 3 other drivers who crashed in the same place. And according to the commentators, there was like a breeze coming out of there that made it really easy for the back end of the car to step out, and you can oversteer. And so maybe there were mitigating factors, and he's not the only one who made that mistake. So to Jimmie's credit, maybe it wasn't his fault, but that's my take on Jimmie Johnson.
I think that's a fair analysis there, Molly, and I think you're really fair to him, because we were actually having a discussion with Denny earlier in the week, FIA Girly, as she goes by the name of, and we were talking about like the honesty of like fans and just how some drivers like Lewis or even Yuki Tsunoda, just one thing goes wrong for them and it's the end of the entire world. The agendas would be agendaring, but certain drivers, they can go week in, week out throwing suboptimal performances and still get away with it, either just because they're living off of a legacy or because of things that they've done in the past, or just generally speaking because, they're likable. And being likable is good. It is something which I think is key in modern day entertainment and also just being a sportsman. But of course, it's not the be all and end all. And there has to be a competitive nature there too. And just before we move on, F1blag, what's your take on the whole Jimmie Johnson thing and how he's struggled to acclimatize so far?
Yeah, I mean, I think calling him the Mazepin was slightly harsh, Molly, but I definitely agree with everything else you said. I mean, he qualified 12th on the street and road courses. He's not as competitive. I think my understanding is he's there to bring eyes. So whether you like that or not, that feels like it's part of their strategy to get, to mop up NASCAR viewers largely from the US. I think I'm not a big follower of NASCAR, but I think he's kind of the joint sort of record holder for the number of series wins. So he's a big name among the NASCAR sort of fraternity, and I expect he's there largely to sell Carvana cars and to get more people watching the sport. But maybe I'm trying to be positive here. Maybe he's doing a good job of making the sport look really hard, because, if you're watching it and they're all taking all the corners fine, oh yeah, it's 200 miles an hour. But after a while, your eyes get used to it and you start to think, yeah, I could do that. But clearly it's really difficult and it's really tiring. So yeah, that's me being positive. He's clearly struggling. I really hope that he can adjust. And maybe the qualifying performance in Indy suggested he might be able to before he has to call it a day.
Absolutely. And
I do too. To be clear, I do want him to succeed in sports. So I was a little harsh, but like I said, he seems like a nice guy. I'm rooting for him to do well. I just am a little skeptical. That's all.
But Molly, I think you have all the rights to, and for me as well, like I think it's only fair, because like we also mentioned that when it's certain drivers, they can get like a bly, but then on certain other drivers, people are very quick to criticize them. I think when you're analyzing and sitting down there, you do have to be honest. And right now, he's not flattered to deceive anyone really with the lackluster performances. But I think there's a balance in everything that was said. And also to touch on F1blag's point too, I kind of see the commercial point that you're raising there too. And when we spoke to Bruce Jones, again, commentator for the GT3 racing and that kind of thing, you mentioned how big Valentino Rossi has been to like the world of GT3 sports car racing, because up until that point there'd been amazing drivers in GT3 racing, but now that you've got Valet, the doctor himself there, the Italian media lap it up, and maybe that's to the disadvantage or to the misfortune of other Italian drivers, which I'm not going to get onto, which get a bit jealous or maybe, rightfully so as well. I feel aggrieved that they don't get the same level of coverage or attention that the bigger names get because of their legacy. So yeah, very interesting conversation there. So moving it forward then, so later down in the timeline of events too, Romain Grosjean, I think, also got loose at that same corner that Molly referred to in relation to Jimmie Johnson. And just generally as well, actually, I'm going to kick this one off to F1blag first. Blag, what do you think of Crispy Nuggets, like, second season, essentially? His basically, homecoming kind of season, because he had the first year, he didn't do a lot of the ovals due to sponsorship issues and maybe rebuilding his confidence after such a huge crash at the Bahrain Grand Prix last year, or no, back in 2020, or Sakia Grand Prix, whichever one it was, I can't remember. But just generally, it seems that Grosjean's found a house now. He seems a lot more happy. I've even seen him busting jokes with Takuma Sato, which again, if you told me that Takuma Sato and Romain Grosjean would be having jokes with each other, I'd be like, what alternative universe is this that you speak of? So yeah, what's your take on Romain Grosjean's transition into Indy so far, and yeah, his progress so far?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I was talking a bit earlier about Jimmie Johnson perhaps making IndyCar look really difficult. There was a risk when Grosjean came in. He'd obviously been in the house sort of pretty much the back of the field in Formula One. And then in his third race, I think he took second, nearly should have really won at the sort of Indy road course just before the Indy 500 last year. It looked like he was going to come in immediately on the pace and was going to start to kind of dominate or win races. He hasn't quite got there. And earlier this season, he had a bit of controversy. I think it was at Alabama, but I can't remember. He basically had some contact with Graham Rahal, which was,
I remember that.
Interesting, a bit spicy. So I mean, he's not perhaps universally loved, to put it that way, up and down the Indy paddock, but yeah, I mean, he's got a second place. I think it was at Long Beach earlier. So he looks like he's on the pace. He could be competitive. He's not particularly up there at the moment in the standings. But yeah, as you suggest, he's found the house. He's taken to it. What other analogies can we give? He's taken to it like a duck to water. I don't think I'd call him a crispy nugget, but he's doing okay. I don't know what you guys think.
Yeah, Molly, what's your take on him so far?
Yeah, I think IndyCar really suits his driving style. Even in F1, he was always the guy who would go for it. Maybe often when he shouldn't. But in IndyCar, there's the style of driving is a lot more. There's a little bit more bumper cars type moves, and you get away with a lot more. Stewarding is consistently more relaxed, I think. So I think that rewards his style of driving. So I think he probably enjoys being able to, and the cars are a lot more robust, right? So if you have one tiny bit of contact, you're not going to end up with losing an aero piece that makes you 5 seconds a lap slower than everybody. So I think he's having more fun on track. I went to, as I mentioned, the Long Beach Grand Prix this year, or not this year. Yeah, this year and last year. And at both races, he was one of the most popular drivers. The crowd loves him. Fans seem to love him. So I think he's really enjoying. He got a lot of criticism, obviously in F1. I think he's enjoying being perceived more positively, by the fans and having people cheer for him. I think all in all, IndyCar is a little bit more of a more friendly, less cutthroat environment, both between the fans and the drivers and the teams, and just how all those different entities relate to one another, I think. And so I could see how, coming from F1, he would feel like he can relax a little bit, enjoy the racing, and become a fan favorite. I do think like he's done quite well. He's had several races now where he's been the standout driver. I do want to see him win a race. I am kind of rooting for him to win a race. It'd be very exciting. But he hasn't quite gotten there. If I recall, the races where he's been able to kind of carve through the field, his pace has fallen off, and he hasn't been able to go for P1 because his tires didn't survive it. So I think it's gonna require some luck and timing on his part to get there. But I hope he does. I want to see it happen.
Yeah, and I think many would agree with you, Molly, just in that analysis of him and how he's adapted to the sport. For me personally, Grosjean sits in a very funny pendulum for me, because on one side, I get increasingly frustrated with him when, he's out here smack talking Lewis. Oh, Lewis shouldn't earn this amount of money. Oh, if I was in charge of F1, I would do this. Oh, if I could do this, I would do this differently. I'm like, bro, what did you achieve, or what credit do you have in the bank to reserve a mortgage on this real estate? But that being said, when I take that kind of off-track stuff out of it, in terms of a driver, he's one of the most competitive guys there. I must say so myself. And this is story. He has a very Niki Lauda-esque story in terms of surviving pretty much an unsurvivable accident in what was that Bahrain incident. I think all of us, our hearts must have skipped a beat when we saw that. I remember when I watched that race live, and I was just like, there's no way. And usually I'm Mr. Positive, so I was like, usually I would always think of the most positive thing, but even for me, I was like, no, we just lost the driver. And then just that kind of scene, I don't want to like dramatize it too much because everyone's spoken about, but he really was like a phoenix rising from the ashes when he jumped over the barrier, and like the medical team, the delegates rushed into the car, and he's like, let go of me, man, you're touching me too much, and he was just probably just thankful. He's thanking his lucky stars that he's still alive. And again, when people go through something so traumatic like that, it almost surprises me psychologically that not only just physically, psychologically, that they could bounce back from it and go back into another car. Arguably, you could say IndyCar, I think for me, per se, is the scarier one of the two. Because with the F1 car, there's accidents and then there's freak accidents. But then with IndyCars, it's just any hesitation, any dirty air, any failure of the car, you're going into a concrete wall at over 230 miles an hour, and it's huge G's of just like pain and just like scariness happening. So for him to take the challenge, for him to just like continue racing, and not like no kind of diss to Adrian Sito driving in the Ferrari challenge at the moment, to still go for one of the highest regards of sports, IndyCar, and to be racing not only just on like race circuits but ovals now, I do have to give him a bit of respect for that. And he has kind of gone up in my estimations, although I feel that he still has some work to do. And it comes with time. Like even Takuma Sato was in Formula One, raced with Honda, raced for a couple of like uncompetitive teams, went to IndyCar, and I'm sure it didn't click straight away. It was like years of being with, one team and building that relationship. And it's nice as well that Mario Andretti and just the Andretti Auto Nation family, they've taken him under the wing, and he's his own star, as Molly mentioned too, with just like all the fans that go to watch him and like love his story, what he's been through. So great analysis there and talking points too. So to segue on to the next bit, then you've got Scott Dixon, which pretty much seemed like he had it just wrapped up in the bag. He was there with my boy Pato Sauce, keeping him company for the large kind of parts of the race. And then you get onto the final row of pit stops. I believe it was Felix Rosenquist, the sister McLaren SP driver, that tried to do the undercut to basically probe Scott Dixon into pitting early. And I can't remember if it's Scott Dixon or if it's Pato that pits first. I think it may have actually been, I want to say Scott Dixon, and then
I think it was Dick.
Yeah, and then
right.
Dixon just like nearly had it, steps on the brakes. What happens? locks the rear brakes, and the thing goes sliding down pit road like a Jamaican bobsled with ice. And just my heart was like, no, dude, no, like you've done everything you needed to do in this race, and just like in just such a minute mistake cost you severely. Because the thing, just to point out to listeners out there, is that unlike Formula One cars that have huge carbon ceramic brakes that run at like 1,000 degrees centigrade, Indy cars run with very skinny brakes, because around the oval, where are you gonna brake? So they run with very, very light brakes that are often cold, because they've not been on the brakes for at least 30 or 40 laps going at full speed, so they cool very easily. And just that mistake basically cost him to lock up into the pits. He broke the speed limit, which of course meant that although he got to serve his pit stop, he then ultimately had to serve a drive-through penalty or stop and go because of the pit lane infringement. So that pretty much threw the race up into the air for most. I, at that stage, was hoping that, there was going to be a lot of hope for my boy Pato. And then Jimmie Johnson does the unthinkable. Jimmie Johnson does a Latifi, and he bins it into the wall, which causes a yellow flag to begin with. And then, FIA, I hope you're listening. I hope that you're taking notes. I'm not saying that this is the right way to do it, but I'm just saying there were options. They didn't want a yellow flag at the end of the race, so they decided to call a red flag. So, in fact, Molly, I'll let you go first. What's your take on how they approached a situation like that, where you have such a major sporting event? For the commercial aspects of it, you don't want it to be like finished under a safety car, rather than the higgy haga FIA, number 5, number 6, extra dip, compass, number 7. Instead of all of that stuff, they're like, you know what, cool. We're just gonna send everybody to pits, red flag the session, and then we'll go out again once everything's been cleared. What was your take on their approach?
So, first of all, the decision they made was safe, and it was within the rules. So those are the two things that really matter to me. They weren't bending or changing their own rules, and they weren't, doing something that was, not prefacing driver safety. So that's like, for me, those are the two top things. So generally, I'm okay with it. I was a little, what's the word? I wasn't wild about it because I don't know if you guys watched the Indy 500 in, I believe it was 2020. It was the year Takuma Sato won the second time. He and Scott Dixon were fighting for the lead, and Sato took the lead. And then right after that, there was a yellow flag. I think it was a crash. I can't remember, but in any case, there was a yellow flag, and it was like less than 5 laps to go, like the very end of the race. And they finished the race under yellow, and Dixon was very close to taking the lead of that race. And he had a very good chance of winning it. If they had red flagged it and restarted it, he probably could have won. And so they did sort of set a precedent back in 2020 that they would end under yellow. So I was like, I kind of think they should have ended the race under yellow, because Ericsson was in the lead by the time this yellow flag came out, if I'm remembering correctly. And then he won the race. So it didn't really change the result of the race the way it might have back in 2020 if they had gone to a red. But so I was like, I kind of think they should have ended under yellow, frankly. But I'm okay with it because, again, they made a decision that was both safe and within the rules. And as long as they can manage to do that, I won't complain too much. My standards are low, I suppose.
I wouldn't say they're low, Molly. I think they're fair, unlike certain governing bodies that make up the rules as they go and favor certain drivers which aren't spoken of because they wear fake golden boots, 2-carat boots, Wembley Market boots. Yeah, they tried to do, I think, what was good for the spectacle of the sport without, like you said, most integrally breaking the rules of the sport. But F1blag, I also want to bring you in this as well, because we've been through the pain, man. We've been through the pain of this in, a very, not similar, but kind of similar like F1 Abu Dhabi finale, what's your take on the whole red flag thing too, as a way of like controlling this race towards the end?
Yeah, we have been through the pain. And yeah, I think I agree with what Molly said. I think my standards are pretty low as well. Like, yes, brilliant. Okay, that's enough for me. I think I was probably rooting for Ericsson because I thought, this is probably, it could be the only chance he has, and he'd done a great job. And so I was disappointed to see them not finish under yellow. But they've done that before, stopped the race and started again a couple of times. So it's in the rules. That's fine. And even if Ericsson, I think he pulled like a 3-second gap because of traffic just before they called a red flag. So I felt a bit bad for him, in that regard. It did remind me of Lewis Hamilton, passing those lap cars, having that 11-second lead over Verstappen. I'm getting PTSD just thinking about it.
Yeah.
But as Molly said, Ericsson didn't lose out. He managed to get a great start and win the race. So, fair enough. They followed the rules, and I don't think it was unfair at all.
Yeah, and I think that's fair because no one can sit down there now and say, they didn't follow the rules. They misconstrued something. They didn't follow their own guidelines, or they jeopardized somebody's safety, for the sake of a spectacle. Like, it was very controlled. And even afterwards, just looking at the body language of the drivers, the ones that didn't win were a bit upset, but there wasn't kind of like either like an unsportsman kind of connotation with how the race directors had governed the end of the race, and just generally how that came, to be. So finally, to get to the elephant in the room then, because I've been so impressed with both of you guys for not basically giving away the race winner, because I thought somebody was going to do it, and I included myself. But to get to the final elephant in the room, Mr. Ericsson hit us. The Swede, Mr. Marcus, weave left and right, slide to the left, slide to the right. Chris, like Marcus Ericsson, of all people, you could have played lottery and you would have probably had more chances of winning that than calling him to be the guy. But Marcus Ericsson is leading an Indy 500 race with like 3 or 4 laps to go. Essentially, the race has been red flagged, so all of his advantage, like F1blag had said, had been gone, been erased. But at least, it had been a standing start, but at least the cars were equal with each other, unlike the FIA with their dodgy scare electrics. But again, let me not get onto them so much. And he just raced his heart out, and like a lion was just trying to break that toe, because he knew that Pato sauce. He was just ready and just pouncing. He was licking his lips. He was like, yeah, boy, it's going to be a Mexican double. Perez in Monaco and me at the Indy 500. And Zack Brown, oh boy, he's going to give me that nice McLaren, that McSauce contract. But Ericsson, all credit to him, from out of nowhere, he defended, he weaved like he needed to do, and again, I didn't see any technical infringement or any kind of foul play called out, even by Pato, which was pretty much the victim of that. And then there was a yellow flag, so I guess that also played into it. But either way, he had everything under control. He really had the measure of everyone behind. And guys, Marcus Ericsson, in my Christian Horner impression, Marcus Ericsson, you are an Indy 500 winner. Jesus Christ. There are many words I thought I would utter, but Marcus Ericsson being an Indy 500 winner. Didn't expect to see that this year. Didn't expect to see that next year. Didn't expect to see that when I have kids. Didn't expect to see that, when F1blag retires out of like, the MI5. Didn't expect to see that when Jorgy runs the F1 team. Didn't expect to see that when Molly becomes like, the chief director of Andretti Autosport. Like, I did never expected that. Guys, after like long ramble, your initial reactions to Marcus Ericsson winning at Indy 500.
Okay, I'll jump in here. So when Marcus Ericsson started leading the race, I tweeted something like, if Marcus Ericsson wins this race, I'm gonna riot. I have to take those words back and admit that he drove well and he deserved to win. I have a bit of a thing with Marcus Ericsson because the first race he won, I believe, ever in IndyCar was last year, and I believe it was the Nashville GP. And if you saw that race, you know that race was like the biggest hot mess you've ever seen. I swear, like 80% of it was spent under yellow. There were so many crashes. The circuit was poorly designed in such a way that it just bred crash after crash. And Ericsson in the race ran into the back of another driver, didn't get a penalty for it, lucked out under a yellow flag, and basically won the race. And it was like he was not even driving well, and he just lucked into a win. So, ever since then, every time a race gets the order gets changed up and there's a yellow flag, my husband and I have this running joke. We're like, oh, great, Marcus Ericsson is going to win this race, right? So we were joking about that. And then he did win. And I was like, what? But he qualified well. He had the pace. His pace on the restart and his defense against Palou was just really impressive. Like, he won and I'm sorry, Marcus. I'm not going to riot. Congratulations, you deserve it.
Oh, it's good to know the streets of LA are safe for now, Molly. But F1blag, what was your take on the Swedish soul? I'm speechless, man. I'll let you speak for me.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know why. I just root for the underdog. And, it might be controversial to call Marcus Ericsson an underdog because people who saw him in F1 probably think he's a pay driver. I think he probably qualifies as one. I don't know, hard to say, probably in F1. But on the day, he's sort of not the name you would associate with winning, the grandest spectacle in motorsport. So something about that made me think when he had the lead with sort of 10 laps ago, Marcus, you can do it. And yeah, he qualified in the fast six. So it's not like he was sort of coming from the back out of nowhere, benefiting from, Dixon's mistake, Palou's bad luck, etc. He was on pace. He kept near the front and he pounced when the time was right. So, fair play to him. He's won a decent amount of money. I hope that he goes from strength to strength. Because of the way that the points are scored, it's a bit like tennis. If you win one of the Grand Slams, it's a hell of a lot of ranking points. He's now leading the IndyCar championship. Wouldn't that be crazy if he won the IndyCar series? But then he finished 6th overall last year. So he's not, it's not out of the question. So yeah, I'm ecstatic for him. He's not the kind of driver that I get up and think, yes, I support Marcus Ericsson. I don't know how many people do, but I am pleased for him. He seems like a survivor. And he feels like the sort of guy that works incredibly hard to maximize the kind of natural talent he has. So, fair play.
Absolutely. And, guys, I can't stress enough, how, big this is in terms of the historical context of what he's achieved. He will go down, whether we like it, love it, or lump it, as one of the drivers that have won one of the most prestigious races of all time. To put it into context, Alonso's in the mud now. Let me get onto Alonso too. It's time for me to fry that guy because he's going to be collateral damage in what I'm going to say next. Imagine Marcus Ericsson has won an Indy 500 before Fernando Alonso-slow. Let me say it again. That's Alonso and slow for that ass because he tried to slow my boy Lewis Hamilton in Monaco, and that absolutely backfired on his teammate being Esteban Ocon. So take that, Alonso. He absolutely, Marcus Ericsson has achieved something that not many people do. Even the greats, such a driver that I just mentioned, hasn't achieved. And Alonso's in the mud. That's my agenda. And a great segue, speaking of people in the mud, because this what's his nickname? This honey badger, he's going to be on Fraud Watch now for the next couple of races. Mr. DR3, Mr. Danny Rick, or Danny Rigardo, because this seems like his whole career is being rigged right now by how he's just getting dominated week in, week out by Lando Norris. Molly, I'll throw it to you first. What's going to happen with Daniel Ricciardo now? Because bear in mind, like we touched on earlier, McLaren have many different motorsport series and projects. So it wouldn't be that hard to see at all if said driver was to be replaced by another said driver within the IndyCar program. Where do you see one Daniel Ricciardo going if McLaren kick him down the road and Zack Brown tells him to, hidey ho? And which IndyCar driver would you like to see take that McLaren seat at the moment?
It's a great question. I don't know what Zack Brown will do. I know what I would do, and I would give his seat to someone else. Frankly, if I were Zack Brown, I think Ricciardo will probably, whether he retires soon or whether he stays in F1 and finds another seat or stays at McLaren, I think he would do quite well in IndyCar. He's obviously a really friendly, charismatic guy. Americans would love him. I think he would be a star. I think he'd probably, if he could get a decent seat, win a lot of races. So, it would, if he chose to go to IndyCar, I think it would be a great move. I can imagine that when he does leave F1, he'll probably try out other racing series. I think if I were to replace him from someone from IndyCar, it's a tough choice between O'Ward and Herta. I think I would go with O'Ward. I want to see an American driver on the grid, so it would be very exciting to see Herta get a seat. However, his speed is incredible, right? Like, no one would argue against that. There's been multiple races this year where he has just outpaced everybody, and you watch him drive and you're like, how is he doing that? No one can keep up with him. But O'Ward is also very quick, and I think he's been a bit more consistent. Herta's made multiple unforced errors where he's put a car into a wall while like leading a race and threw away race wins like that. He's one of those drivers I think just drives at 10 tenths, and that it's at high risk, high reward style. If I'm Zack Brown and I'm running the McLaren F1 team, I'm going to be worried about the cost cap, frankly. And I think that Pato can get speed out of the car, but is less likely to expensive crashes. So that's why I would go with Pato. That's not to say I wouldn't love to see Herta in an F1 car. That'd be awesome, really exciting, and I think he's got the talent for it. So he would be my choice, Pato. I do think that you can't have this conversation without mentioning Oscar Piastri, who would be my top choice for the seat. But he's also an Alpine driver. I know I think there's an agreement in place for him to be a reserve driver for, I believe it's McLaren. But so we'll see what happens. But I think he's the obvious choice. That's my take. Mostly, I just want to see all three of them in F1 cars.
Same here, Molly. You wouldn't be alone in that one, and I agree with those points that you mentioned as well. And great kind of review on all three of those options, because I agree. If you've got Pato O'Ward in there, I think he's the most complete in terms of what he has to offer. Again, he's a very super likable guy. If people aren't following Pato O'Ward, I implore them to, because he's so funny. Like, his tweets, he's got that kind of goofy nature to him, a bit like Ricciardo, but in the same sense too. When it comes to business means business with that guy, and he's serious. He's really, I think they need to call him maybe Pato El Chapo O'Ward, because I've seen red with that guy. When it comes to overtaking people, he really makes his intentions known, and I like his moves because they're usually clean. There's not any second guessing, or there's not kind of a Colton situation where he pulls off some miraculous moves, but then that there's always the 5-10% chance it could go completely left after that 10 minutes or 10 seconds later, depending on what happens. So true. And I wanted to throw the same question as well and actually lead with another one after to F1blag. Where do you see this Daniel Ricciardo situation at McLaren? And should Zack Brown decide, to get a bit more serious with things down there, Ron Dennis style, who from like the IndyCar program could you see being a good shout for them?
I really don't understand this Ricciardo thing. I mean, that let's use the word fraud jovially. Like, maybe he's been a fraud all along. I'm trying to work it out. Like, so he burst onto the scene by beating Vettel in the first year of turbo hybrid, and so people thought washed, as I believe the youngsters call it these days.
That's correct, sir.
But also, or they called it about 10 years ago behind. But so I think maybe we overplayed that, and he's a good driver, but he's not great. And maybe we just sort of, like how lots of drivers make their name by being compared to Lewis. Like Russell at the moment, people think he's sort of world class because he's sort of having results that are better than Lewis at the moment. Maybe we just thought too much of Ricciardo, because then when you work through in terms of his teammates, so then he had Verstappen. In fact, no, he had Kvyat, and that wasn't, it didn't smash Kvyat. And then you had sort of young Verstappen, he sort of beat him, but then Verstappen by the end of the pairing was in front on pace. He beat Hülkenberg, but Hülkenberg had 10 years without a podium. He beat young Ocon. But it's not a track record. So there's something there. And then in terms of what's going on this season, maybe Norris is just really good, and maybe he's sort of driving out of his skin. Some of the qualifying performances in particular he put in last season. So maybe there's something there. I mean, also, Ricciardo saying, "Oh, I don't know any of the technical stuff to do with the car." Like, is he trying to just be relatable and pretend he doesn't know, or does he really not know? Like, or is he sort of just, we're all human. He just sort of said something in the heat of the moment that was a bit silly. So yeah, I don't get the Ricciardo thing. I believe he was, until Verstappen got his new contract, I believe that Ricciardo was the second highest paid driver on the grid at some point. So I don't think his salary is going to be sustainable for very long. So I can't, you listen to the quote from Zack Brown that suggested it might be as soon as the end of the season that he's out of McLaren. And then, who would I like to see in the car? I'm going to switch and be the negative one now. I'm quite protective of the IndyCar sort of drivers, Pato, Colton, etc. I don't want them having not really raced on some of the tracks and having, perhaps raced on them, but in really junior formula 5-10 years ago. I don't want them to go in and be trying to get up to speed in a high pressure car and fail. And maybe they need to take the leap and maybe they'll get through it. But I just think it's a really big ask. And we're going to mention Mazepin again here, and maybe you'll tell me it's a bad example. But do you remember last season? I got a bit of flack for this online. I think Haas didn't have a simulator, and Mick got to use a simulator, but Mazepin didn't. And I remember he was crying after one qualifying. I can't remember what track it was, but he'd never raced there before. And he was like 1.5 seconds off the pace. Like, I don't think we should underestimate how hard it is if you've never raced at a track to get up to speed in, Friday, Saturday. So, yeah, I mean, I'd love to see Palou, just because we've not mentioned him, Alex Palou. I'd love to see him given a shot because he seems cool and calm and collected. Maybe not the greatest raw speed, but a bit like what you were talking about, Pato would keep the car in good shape, and we'd see what happens. But I also agree we need an American on the circuit. It's been too long. So yeah, long answer. Don't know what's going on with Ricciardo. It could be over this season, and yeah, I'll root for Palou just because we haven't mentioned it.
Yeah, fair points there as well, F1blag. And I actually wanted to kind of add to those as well, because just in relation to Daniel Ricciardo thing, it's getting sticky for him, isn't it, guys? Because the thing is now is like what Molly was saying, where do you go from here? Because in terms of a big move, that's done and dusted now. Like, you can't go to Ferrari. Ferrari already have their long-term program sorted out with Charles, with Sainz. I'm sure Sainz will find his form as the season progresses, Mr. Smooth Operator and the rest, And even if Sainz didn't work out, as much I don't think Mick has earned it, they would want, I guess, for the commercial aspects to put Mick in there or somebody of that kind of nature in the family or in that seat. So Ferrari's a no-go. Red Bull, as long as Helmut Marko's alive, I don't think we'll ever take Daniel Ricciardo back. We've seen that that's been a thing at Red Bull. They're very cutthroat and want to drive at least stable, like Sebastian Vettel. It doesn't matter what the situation is. They just don't go back to the X's. So that doesn't seem on the cards. Mercedes, personally, I think Mercedes have enough drivers in their academy. You've got drivers like Nick de Vries, another underrated driver that goes under the radar. How can you win a F2 championship, a Formula E championship, and still not get a drive in Formula One? That has to be, to me, the biggest disastrous monstrosity, like in like, you know, modern day history, that he still hasn't got a drive, like, or any kind of thing up until recently with the Williams test at Barcelona. So again, Mercedes have enough that they can chew on, and I think on top of that, Mercedes would like aim for the future rather than going for something like Daniel Ricciardo. So then you then look at the current kind of like teams on the grid. Is Alpha gonna take him? Is Alpha a sideways step? Maybe. Would Alpine again? Would he go back to Renault? Would Renault have him? Would Alpine have him? When you got Piastri there now as well, sideways step. You know, you've got Aston Martin there too, but again with the whole Volkswagen, Audi, Porsche thing brewing in the background, are they going to be interested? Probably not. And following GT3 racing, Porsche have a plethora of like, you know, like young and experienced drivers that they could throw into a car and you know, do that kind of thing. So again, probably not. So I come to the same conclusion that Molly's made of. It might be a NASCAR thing. It might be an IndyCar thing. Daniel Ricciardo might grow back the pedo stash like where he grew at Austin last year, and that might just be his thing. So very haunting to think about.
Please, God, no, don't do that. Daniel Ricciardo, if you're listening, don't do that.
Yeah, we don't like the pedo stash, Danny. Please just leave the pedo stash this year. But yeah, and then in terms of drivers, I think both of what you guys said is so true. Like, you know, you've got the talents and they make the series so like sparky to me in terms of Colton Herta and, you know, Pato, because Pato's aggressive and mean as hell when he needs to be. I remember he hunted down Venus Veekay on like cold tires. And in IndyCar as well, there are no tire warmers, so on cold tires he was being aggressive, and I was like, he's gonna crash this thing. But again, just like Molly said, he knows the limit probably a bit more than Colton, and was able to just get out of the cold tire window and then launch one down the inside of Veekay clean. And then on the other side, you've got Colton, which again, he's just probably, I think, the more raw, the less refined one of the two. But again, just he's like a sledgehammer. Like the guy is just like there, and he's not kind of subtle about it either. He's really angry and just aggressive too, which again, it's such a juxtaposition, because then when you look at him with his long hair, you're like, he looks like he could be in a Justin Bieber tribute band. So yeah, interesting one for Colton. But then I agree with F1blag too. You've got like a journeyman like Alex Palou, which I think kind of, again, he's from that same kind of young high school group of young drivers. But I think because he's more reserved, because he's European as well, like because he's Spanish, that actually might play into his thing a bit more. Because I think before he did IndyCar F1blag, he was doing a lot of like Formula Japan and doing a lot of Formula racing, but just in the Japanese series too. That's why I think he's got the gorilla logo, because he's interested in anime culture and stuff like that you all learn in Japan. So again, maybe the safest bet might actually be Alex. And again, he's been IndyCar champion. So just in terms of the marketability, maybe not as marketable as Jimmie Johnson, of course, but again, you can't take the credit away from him. You know, I don't see Alex Palou selling any Carvana anytime soon. But again, definitely up there. So great conversation. And I didn't want to really like repackage the same question twice, but it is slightly nuanced. There's also been a lot of talk about Andretti like making headway into F1. Unfortunately, it didn't happen this year, and it's unlikely to happen next year, just with the FIA and then the teams lobbying, basically the prize money being diluted by another team coming in. But I'll throw it to F1blag first. Blag, just if Mario Andretti, the wise old legend, he gets his wish to have an F1 team in Formula One, and you've got Colton Herta, which is in their stable. You've also got Romain Grosjean in their stable two, do you see them potentially getting a shot? Would it, if you had to pick out of Colton Herta or Romain Grosjean to be one of the two drivers of a F1 team for Andretti, which one would you pick?
I'm going to cheat. Wouldn't you pick both? Because you want an experienced, see, it's a cop-out. You'd want an experienced F1 driver alongside a rookie, right? And I know that Grosjean would have spent, if they come in 2024, sort of 3 years out of the sport, but out of F1. But, you know, someone that knows the tracks, someone that knows how to set up the car at the tracks, you know, a benchmark against which you can kind of then assess Herta's, you know, pace or help Herta with setup. As I say, I don't want to underestimate how hard it is to kind of get on the pace really quickly if you've not been at the track. So, yeah, that's my cheat answer. The one thing I would say about Andretti trying to get into F1, do you remember every so often the teams sign a new Concord agreement? I think the last one was done in about 2020. And when they agreed that, they all, because it's a closed shop, it's a bit of a cabal. They said, right, we're the 10 teams. If a new team wants to come in, they need to pay $200 million, and that will be split nicely juicily between all 10 teams. So it does feel a little bit mafioso that they're, you know, making it difficult for new teams to come in. And that's probably why you see Audi and, you know, Porsche looking to buy McLaren and Red Bull, because why would you put £200 million in that just simply is a fee? It's not a deposit. It's not, you know, anything like that. You just have to put it in and it goes to the other team. So look, picking the drivers is difficult. I think I'd pick both. Why not? But I don't even think it's straightforward that Andretti are going to get into F1. But let's see. I don't know, Molly, if you're more hopeful than I am.
That was a great answer. I don't know that I'm more hopeful. I definitely strongly think that the FIA and the teams should allow Andretti to join. You know, I can't think if we're ever going to have an American team on the grid. I don't really consider Haas an American team because, yes, the owner is American, but it's, you know, it's largely European and they don't have any American drivers. So it's sort of a semi-American team. But if we truly want an American team on the grid, I can't think of a better organization to do it than Andretti. I don't think there's another racing organization or manufacturer in the US who could do a better job than they could. You know, Andretti also brings the value of his name, which is huge. He's the biggest name in American motorsport. And of course brings with him fans from all the other forms of American motorsport. I just think that this is a great opportunity for F1 to expand in the US, and I really hope they don't squander it. It does feel, as F1blag said, very much a mafioso kind of setup that the new team has to buy their way in with this huge check, and they don't get anything for it. It's not, you know, in exchange for anything. They don't. It's not a deposit. That's actually it's actually the rules. Like, that's kind of crazy. But I just hope that the sport takes the long view. You know, they're trying to grow F1 all over the world, including the American market, and the teams and the organization, they all seem thrilled coming to the US, the Miami Grand Prix, that there were so many fans and it was such a hit, and that there seems to be such a, you know, growing interest here in the US. But you can't just rest on that. You have to build that and give American fans a sense that, like, we have a stake in the sport, and this is the best opportunity for them to do that. So be smart F1, don't let me down.
Well, Molly, I say that every week, you know, and without fail.
They keep letting us down, don't they?
Exactly, this without fail. So, but again, I agree with what both you guys have said. It would be, again, not being cheesy here, the American dream, such to say, you know, to actually see that happen. Because the next thing that I'll just point out is completely unrelated. When we were watching the Sky coverage of the Miami Grand Prix, Mr. Andretti himself was on the grid during Martin Brundle's, I'm not even gonna call it a grid walk. It was like Martin Brundle's like meltdown as such, which we spoke about earlier in the week. But yeah, like he did actually speak to Mario Andretti, and Andretti, he just said to Mario, like, what is your bucket list? And Mr. Mario himself was like, I would like to drive right in front of Zack Brown, by the way. I would like to drive a modern day Formula One car. And I was like, oh, Zack, you have to let that man drive that car. You cannot do that to him. You have to let Mario. I don't even care how old he is. Like, he could be a fossil. I need you. I'm on my knees, pause. Like, I need you to give Mario Andretti a chance to drive, like, you know, a modern day F1 car, because that'd be so cool. And again, it's just the history, as Molly said, the heritage, that name alone, just it has so much weight and legacy. And you know, there are not many teams where you've got, like, you know, like a successful racing driver. I mean, we've had Prost, but they weren't much of a success. F1blag, didn't we have Stewart? Didn't we have Jackie Stewart with a F1 team at one stage?
Yeah. I mean, that's one I can remember. So thanks for appealing to my sort of middle age. But yeah,
I wanted to poke you there.
he was really smart, actually, because he set the team up, and then within a couple of years had sold it to Ford, and it was repackaged as Jaguar. But yeah, I think they won at least one race with Johnny Herbert, maybe two, I can't remember. But yeah, definitely, like, it's a bit of a mixed bag in terms of Formula World champions setting up teams, because I think Emerson Fittipaldi essentially destroyed his Formula One career and then left to go and do Indy, because he started racing for his or his brother's team after winning the second world championship that he'd won. So yeah, it's a bit of a mixed bag. I'd love to see Andretti on the grid, but as I say, when you've got to put 200 million US into the hands of your competitors, not as a deposit, it feels like an uphill battle. But there we are.
It's so true. And also, just to add on that whole thing of like former F1 drivers or champions that have gone on to have successful teams, you know that Bruce McLaren guy, that guy with the plucky bird that now just looks like an arrow. You know the orange team? Yeah, they've not done so bad over the years. You know, a couple Mika Hakkinen championships. You know, a world championship with Sir Lewis Hamilton, and a young Lando. You know, keeping strives up there. Yeah, those McLaren geezers down the road, they're not doing so badly these days. It's like essentially an owner-driver team too. So yeah, I think, like both of you guys have said, there's a lot of potential there. It would make everything for a great story, but there's politics in F1 as well. And that was many moons ago when I met Georgina. Shout out to the boss, which also, you reminded me of something. I need to finally, this is my perfect opportunity to ask as well, but I'll do it when we conclude the show. Again, it was one of the first things we talked about, like politics in F1, just how over the years it's become more about this money and this brand, and just like, and even just the other day, I think I was having a discussion with like my IT manager, and he's like, oh, well, Ferrari, like, you know, want to throw their handbags out and leave the sport, they should do so. And I was like, as much as I'm a Schumacher fanboy, I wouldn't be great for the sport, would it? And he was like, true, but Denzel, and he said this, he was like, Ferrari need F1 as much as F1 need Ferrari, because to be honest, the people that unless you're Vincenzo, shout out to Vincenzo, and you're Italian, like there's not many of us that are gonna go and buy a Ferrari tomorrow. So our interactions with Ferrari are ultimately through F1, and if they were to leave, then you know what happened to all the merchandise sales, or like how marketable would they be then, other than like, you know, maybe a rapper having a Ferrari in a video and whatnot too. So it's changed a lot, the scope and landscape of the sport, and just how political some of the agreements are, and like basically barriers to trade of such when it comes to even new teams being able to put a marker down. But hopefully we can get someone with that. And again, just we're coming to the end of the show. It's been a really amazing one. I've loved it, and it's been so different. I wanted to kick off with Molly on this one. Molly, short question. Why are IndyCar fans less tribal than F1 fans? Controversial question. Awkward pause.
Yes. I've thought a lot about this. It's wildly different between the two sports. I think some of it is the media. You have the media around F1 really creating narratives and just really shit stirring constantly. asking really pointed questions, drawing comparisons, writing articles, questioning whether a driver can hack it or not, all of that kind of thing. And just really creating a lot of drama in the sport. And I think that amps up the dialogue to a degree that isn't always great in F1. A lot of this is, we could see this with the whole like jewelry debacle and in F1 and all the articles that were coming out about that and the ridiculous headlines. And it was really like, it was all quite silly. You don't see that in IndyCar because it's much more focused on the actual racing, and the way that the media reports on IndyCar isn't, they're not trying to create that sort of dialogue around the sport. That also goes hand in hand, I think, with the money. Obviously, Indy sport, I'm not sure what the actual value of IndyCar is compared to F1. I know I looked this up once, and I believe F1 is currently valued at like 13 or 14 billion. IndyCar is not nearly valued that highly, and there's not as much money in the sport. And so, I think that creates a less cutthroat environment. The conversation around the sport doesn't get as heated. And so that really, I think, passes on to the fans and the way we talk about the sport. The drivers don't have that kind of like, there's rivalries, and of course they like to compete with one another, but a lot of the drivers actually, they get along quite well. At least they seem to. They don't talk shit about each other in the media or anything like that, the way you sometimes see in F1. So all of that together, I think, creates a very different culture in the sport that affects the fans.
Yeah,
it's a long answer to a short question.
Well, sometimes it's needed, Molly, and I'm very thankful for that too, because I think we often say, what can the FIA do better? But I think also, what can F1 fans, especially the toxic ones, like F1blag will get this reference, the toxic waste fans, because there's a suite in the UK called Toxic Waste. It's the most Molly, if you ever get to try one, it's the most toxic suite ever. But yeah, there are a lot of fans out there, and I get it, like, it's cool to have banter and sometimes have a laugh at other people's expense. But I think in Formula One it gets too heated too quickly. Whereas I think Molly rightfully said there too, there's a lot of common respect amongst the drivers. And again, maybe the money thing as well also plays a key part into it too. So there's no need really to behave in such a way. But yeah, even when you do see drivers like having a disagreement, like, it's often just dusted there and then. Like F1blag mentioned the very heated Graham Rahal, which again, I like him as a character because he's very unfiltered. Like, it's very just black or white with him. And I can kind of see how he's taken to Romain Grosjean, being a guy that's just come into what you could say is his sport natively, and how Grosjean's committed like numerous offenses. And now he's been on like the kind of receiving end of one, and he just was not having it. I remember vividly just seeing, like, I don't know who it was, Graham Rahal, who was speaking to me. He's just like barging him, and he's like, yeah, he push me. I was like, oh my God, this is really heated. But again, it's nice to know that it doesn't go any further than that. Like, it's usually just like resolved there and then you don't have like Windsor Spice like come in the next race. My driver was involved in a 56 impact. And that's not on, and you don't stick around tops. And that's probably my best Christian Horner impression. God damn, you need to pay me for this stuff. But yeah, like it's a completely different this atmosphere, and I'm more here for it. F1blag, any compliments or comments on that as well?
Yeah, and I should say that your Christian Horner impression is up there with your Bernie Eccleston impression from the last time I was on. But yeah, I think I agree with everything that Molly said. Of course, I would kind of compliment that point about it's much more about the racing. It's more old school. But the other point I'd make is that IndyCar, from a kind of scale perspective, is smaller in terms of the reach. And I think when things become a bit mainstream, they attract people that perhaps aren't, let's say, purists. They're not in it for the mechanical or technical or sporting aspects. They're in it for the drama. I think, again, you young folk might call it stan culture. I've had my account since about, yeah, exactly. I'm down with it, as they would say. So I've had my account since about 2014. I just set it up on a whim at Christmas, and back then I just remember there was none of this. It was a few people a bit sort of rude to each other, but it was mainly because they were sort of showing each other up how much they knew about the sport. And I think now we're at the point where, you know, Formula One has been successful in reaching a new audience, a bigger audience, but one that's less interested in the sort of pure racing. And I'm not making a judgment on those sort of Drive to Survive fans, because we all come in at different stages. I think, therefore, the drivers in IndyCar, the teams, and the broadcaster knows that IndyCar is small, and the only way that, or smaller, let's say, and the only way they're going to grow it is if they sort of band together and put on a really good product. So I think that's the scale thing for me is probably one of the major differences that causes, you know, for me, I find IndyCar this season definitely much more enjoyable to watch as someone that loves motorsport.
Absolutely, you know, and I like that too. And in a way, I don't know if it's been the same for you guys. I find it just a breath of fresh air. It's almost like I have a reprieve now, because like we mentioned, things in F1, they getting very heated from week in, week out. You know, every race I could give you something new. So in Bahrain, like, you know, basically everyone was getting onto Red Bull and the reliability issues. Then in Saudi Arabia, we had this thing with, like, you know, the race directors. We had like a JCB tractor in one of the F2 races. It's terrible. In Australia, it actually wasn't too bad, to be fair. I think that was actually one of the more kind of calm races. But then we had Imola, and then you had the Tifosi again, and kind of just talks of just like these cars and wet conditions. Things then started to get a bit more nasty, I think, towards kind of Cataluna and Barcelona, where you had the whole Green Bull allegations. And then this week that just went by in Monaco, you've had this whole jury gate thing still prolonging itself, and so forth too. Whereas in IndyCar, I'll just turn it on, and week in, week out, without fail, I see a good race. And that's all we could ask for as motorsport fans, I guess, first. And, you know, the entertainment that comes secondary to that. So absolutely, you know, and just to round it up, guys, and actually there's a final question after this one I'll ask, but I need to get the boss lady back in. So I'm going to text her whilst I line this up. Firstly, with you, Molly. Molly, are there any other races that you'll be going to this year or want to go through to this year for the IndyCar calendar and F1blag? I mean, you can chime in on that one too, Molly. If you could let IndyCar race at any track that's currently on the F1 calendar, where'd you go and why? So I'll start off with Molly on that one.
Great question. In terms of other races, I don't have tickets to any other races this year. Obviously, I didn't get to go to the Indy 500 this year. I would love to go. It is on my bucket list. Maybe next year. I actually grew up about 3 hours from Indianapolis. Didn't become an IndyCar fan until I moved to California. So now I'm a lot further away. So I need to go back and go to the Indy 500 one year. So that's definitely something that I want to do in my lifetime. In terms of tracks that I would like to see IndyCars race on, oh, that's a great question. I think I would go with Brazil, Interlagos.
Ooh.
You know, it's just generally a great track, and even in F1 cars, it's exciting and there's a lot of passing. Indy cars with the, you know, less aero that they run, you'd probably get even more passing. And it's also not a super high speed track. Indy cars, I think the street tracks tend to be a little bit slower than compared to street and road courses in IndyCar versus F1. So I think they would be better suited to something like Interlagos rather than like Baku or something like that. But I just think that would be super exciting, and it's a great track you can't miss with Brazil. So
yeah, and Molly, you've actually given me a superb idea for the sim. So thank you for that. IndyCars at Brazil. You heard it here first on Stripping the Dipping. But F1blag, how about you? Like, where would you like to see IndyCar go on the current F1 calendar? You can't say Brazil now because that's been taken.
No, I wasn't going to go Brazil, but it would be nice to see. You know, back in the day, Kart or Champ Car did have a race. I think it was in Rio. They may have kind of concreted over that circuit to build the Olympic Park. But it would be good to see IndyCar expand into sort of Latin America again. So that would be great. I would say, with the art of Wikipedia with me, I would say that we should bring IndyCar back to Monza. So apparently, in the late 50s, they used to race on the banked part of Monza. I don't think we're going to get the health and safety inspectors to sign that off in 2022. But the long straight, the Curva di Alboreto, as it's now called, Parabolica, seeing the IndyCar cars going through there, the braking into turn one, I think it would be fascinating. The one note of caution that I would make, which is, I feel like I've been a bit dour today. I was prepping for this podcast, doing my homework. We already see, I think IndyCar might have taken it off the circuit, but used to race at Circuit of the Americas. Might still do, I can't remember. And they were about 14 seconds a lap slower. And I hate seeing that, because it kind of, if you're really superficial, you might go, oh well, yeah, that it's a lower series or it's not as good. There are all sorts of reasons why the cars don't run as quickly. Could you, Denz, you showed why F1 couldn't race on Indianapolis. The cars are specialized, so there's a reason why it doesn't. So that's the note of caution. But yeah, my answer would be Monza. I think it would be fantastic, and the fact you could get, I love Rossi partly because he runs the 27, so maybe he can have a one-off red 27 livery. That'll be amazing.
Hey, well, listen, the Monza 500, as pioneered by F1blag as well, I'm still with that idea too. But yeah, again, great kind of thought process behind that as well. And again, probably not on the old version of it, but it'd just be super cool just to see that happen with modern cars, considering it happened many years ago in the 50s, with IndyCar back then. So absolutely. Now, before I give you guys the final word, some time ago, Molly did ask, and I hope you're listening, Boss Lady Georgina, because this is where I throw you underneath a bus now after you tried to catch me out earlier. Molly did ask a very reasonable and also very interesting question as well, which I don't even know the answer to, because I was just approached by Georgina. I was like, you know what? I'd love to host a podcast. I've never done it before. Let me have a stab at this thing. But the question was that Molly asked, I'm sure she remember, is Georgina, how was the name Stripping the Dipping conceived? Because again, before you answer, we had Dr. Obbs on here a couple of weeks ago, and he was like, I told my missus I'm going on a podcast. I was like, oh, great, man. What did she say? She was like, she said, what's the name of the podcast? And then he was like, Stripping the Dipping. And I laughed so hard. He was like, she pulled the biggest face because she thought it was something explicit, something that could only be mentioned on a certain website, which there's paid content for, which I won't elaborate on further until they cut me a check. Basically, yeah, the name is very interesting. I've always thought of Stripping the Dipping as you're going behind the veil, you're going behind the visor, and you're you're looking in. And I didn't actually want to say that because now easily Georgina could say, yeah, that's what it means. But Georgina Donna, I genuinely want you to answer the question, and honestly as well, what is the name? What is the story behind the name?
Yeah, that's what it means.
No. You can't, even if that is the case now, you can't use that. That was my idea.
All right. So at first, when I came up with the idea of starting the podcast, and I was telling this idea, and then I was just thinking about the names, and I had a couple of names. And I was telling it to Natsumi, and then she was asking me for the names. And then at that moment, I only had one name in my head, and it was not Stripping the Dipping. I just told her, and then I had to give her a couple of more for examples and for choices. So within a second, I just said Stripping the Dipping, because I was thinking when I was saying that, because first of all, when you say stripping the dipping, it attracts people because it's something unusual. So that attracts people. And, it's like you call a political conversation podcast Naked World, but you go to see what this naked world is, but it's actually a political conversation.
So you're clickbaiting them, Jorgy, you're clickbaiting
Yeah.
them.
So, something like that. And the meaning behind it was actually the one that you just said it, because, we go through some of the life, some of the knowledge, experience, we strip everything down. It's like we are stripping the dipping, because, basically we talk about topics we often rather not talk. So, keeping it real.
Well, I think that's a fair answer, and I'm glad you clarified that too, because I've always wondered. But again, it's nice to know that my thinking wasn't too far away in terms of its symmetry. But yeah, there you go, guys. You live and you learn. So that is the meaning and history behind the name of the podcast, of course. And yeah, you'd be disappointed if you thought there was any X-rated content on this channel. Of course not. We're a grown channel. And Helmut Marko looks like some bull sacks. But anyway, coming off of that now. Honestly, F1blag, Molly, it's been so incredible to have you on. We need to get you guys as regulars more often anyway. F1blag, I think, actually joining me for something we can't, or I don't think we should mention just yet, but that's going to be a bombshell if and when it does happen, potentially next week. But guys, any final thoughts from you at all? Just and where can people follow you, of course, to engage with your lovely selves? Will Buxton, awkward silence. Who wants to go first?
I'll go. Final thoughts. If you are a motorsport fan and you are not watching IndyCar, you are missing out. Give it a try. If you are coming, I suggest that you make sure the first race you watch in IndyCar is a straight or road course. Oval racing is super cool, but it's kind of a different beast, and it takes a little bit to understand what's happening. But it's a really cool form of racing. It's just a very different skill set. So yeah, don't count out IndyCar. It's great racing, especially if you're, as F1blag said, if you're here for the actual cars and the racing and not just the drama. And in terms of where you can find me, I'm on Twitter. My handle is MollyFS44. I am a very loudmouth Lewis Hamilton fan. So if you don't like that, don't follow me. That's pretty much it.
You heard what she said, and wise words from Molly there too. Honestly, why do I think, Molly, I really feel you need to start a podcast or be on a podcast more regularly, because just your takes are amazing. I must say so myself. It's been amazing.
I rant a lot, so gotta put
ranting
it
is what we
somewhere.
do best.
Yeah.
Thank you. And of course, F1blag, over to you. Final words, where they can find you, and man, I want to continue teasing the listeners as well as to what me and you know about that. Yeah, they don't know about yet, but they'll know about hopefully soon.
Yeah, I'm so nervous about accident, but if it happens, it's going to be amazing. It will honestly be a huge privilege. So let's see, and it will be great to do it together. That sounds weird, doesn't it? So there you go. We're building on the stripping the dipping theme, and now people are going to have completely the wrong idea, but it will be fantastic. Yeah, final words. I think, everything that Molly said was great. And yeah, Molly, you should get a podcast ranting with absolutely fire, spot on takes. Just do it. But no, the thing about IndyCar is the speed is phenomenal. The average speed at Indy is 235 or whatever miles an hour. Formula One in recent years has started using kilometers an hour, and it might make it look a bit faster, the number. The IndyCar speed, that's 380 kilometers an hour. It's you don't see those numbers in F1. The fuel adds another dimension. The racing, there were four wide at some point, and then another Helio Castroneves was behind. It was incredible, and they're always on the edge. I mean, that's why you see contact and crashes, and thankfully in the last few years a lot of safety. So yeah, I love IndyCar. It's a great thing to watch. Sometimes Sky Sports F1 could decide to kind of have a 2-hour after race F1 show instead of showing the IndyCar live, but most of the time they have it on there. So if you're in the UK, do check it out. And of course, you can find me at F1blag on Twitter. largely agreeing with Nick Knowles at DIY SOS as my brother in arms. But no, I hope to see you on Twitter, and I hope to be back on here sometime soon because it's an absolute
Very
pleasure.
soon.
Thanks. Yeah. We hope. Yeah, we've left a mental image that might not be the right one, so I apologize for that.
Oh man, well listen, it's up to the imagination, but again, amazing to have F1blag on here as well. I'm positive we're going to be back here again next week for something extraordinarily awesome, so be sure to tune in for that. But guys around the world, in fact, this is your perfect opportunity. There's actually an IndyCar race this weekend. It's in Detroit. Belle Isle. Shout out to Rhett Jackson from Detroit. You know, make sure you check it out. I was doing some hot laps there as well. So if you're into sim racing or you want to get a stare what the track is like, I did an awesome comparison video of me in the sim sweating my ass off against Joseph Newgarden, which just made it seem like the most easiest thing ever. So yeah, make sure that you check out the race this weekend at Belle Isle. It's going to be really groveling and tricky race for those guys out there, but it's going to be some awesome overtaking, push to pass, fuel management, tire saving, ballsy, outbraking maneuvers into 90-degree corners. Everything you love to see and more. And this for the listeners out there as well. We hope that you're keeping well. We're hoping that you're looking after your mental health, of course. You know, that we hope you're taking it easy. If you're in the UK, we hope that you're enjoying the Platinum Jubilee or Silver Jubilee, whichever one it is. I'm not quite sure. And just generally speaking as well, you guys are looking after yourselves. And if you ever need anyone to talk to at all, we're always here to listen, always here to receive positive and constructive feedback. And yeah, make sure you look after yourselves, make sure you have fun, make sure that you guys do everything that's great in the world. And until next time, it's been DJ Denz, because I've been cooking up some bangers. And until next time on Stripping and Dipping, we'll catch you again. See ya!